The morning bell rang through the halls of Riverside Prep Academy, and 12-year-old Maya Chen pulled her backpack tighter against her shoulders. She walked past groups of laughing students in their designer clothes and expensive sneakers, keeping her eyes down. Her own sneakers had a small tear near the toe, carefully colored over with a black marker so it wouldn't be as noticeable. Maya had been at this school for 3 months now, and every single day felt like walking through a minefield. She was here on a scholarship, something that seemed to be written across her forehead in invisible ink that everyone could somehow see. The other kids knew. The teachers knew. And they made sure she knew that they knew. Her next class was advanced music with Mrs. Wellington, and Maya's stomach twisted into knots just thinking about it. She loved music more than anything in the world, but that classroom had become her own personal nightmare. Mrs. Wellington was a tall woman with silver hair always pulled back in a tight bun, wearing expensive suits and pearl necklaces. She taught music like it was a competition, and she had already decided that Maya didn't deserve to be in the race. Maya slipped into the classroom and headed straight for her usual spot in the back corner. She set down her worn notebook, the one with the torn cover that she'd repaired with tape, and tried to make herself invisible. Around her, the other students chatted easily about their weekend piano lessons with private tutors, about their new sheet music, about the grand pianos in their homes. "Did you hear Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata playing from the music room yesterday?" one girl was saying. "That was me practicing. My instructor says I'm really improving on the difficult passages." "Oh, that's wonderful," another student replied. "I've been working on Chopin's Nocturne. My parents just bought me this beautiful edition of his complete works. The pages are so crisp and white, nothing like those old books from the library." Maya looked down at her own hands. These were hands that had practiced piano for hours every single day, but not on some grand piano in a mansion. She practiced on her grandmother's old upright piano, the one that sat in the corner of their tiny apartment. Half the keys stuck, several notes were out of tune, and the bench wobbled. But it was hers to use, and she loved it. She had started playing when she was 5 years old. Her grandmother, who lived with them, had taught her the very first notes, middle C, then D, then E. Maya could still remember the magic of that first day, how pressing down on those keys could create sound, could create music, could create something beautiful out of thin air. While other kids were outside playing, Maya was at that piano. Before school, after school, late into the evening until her mother would gently tell her it was time for bed. Her 3 younger siblings would sometimes gather around to listen, and those were the moments when everything felt right in the world. The cramped apartment, the constant worry about money, her father who had left when she was 7, all of it would fade away when she played. But here at Riverside Prep, her music meant nothing. Mrs. Wellington walked into the classroom, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She set her leather bag down on the desk with a loud thump that made everyone fall silent. Her eyes swept across the room, lingering on Maya for just a moment too long, and that familiar look of disapproval crossed her face. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Wellington said, her voice cold and precise. "Today we'll be discussing the importance of proper musical education and training. As I'm sure you all know, true musicianship requires years of dedicated study with qualified instructors, access to quality instruments, and a deep understanding of classical technique." As she spoke, her eyes kept drifting back to Maya. It was subtle, but Maya noticed. She always noticed. "Some people," Mrs. Wellington continued, "believe that raw enthusiasm can replace proper training. They believe that simply playing around on an instrument makes one a musician. But we know better, don't we?" Several students nodded and a few glanced back at Maya. She felt her cheeks burn hot with shame. She wanted to sink through the floor and disappear. The lesson continued, and Mrs. Wellington asked questions about music theory, about time signatures and key changes and harmonic progression. These were things Maya had taught herself from library books and free videos online, but the terminology was different from what Mrs. Wellington used. When she called on Maya, which she did often, it was always with questions designed to expose what Maya didn't know. "Miss Chen," Mrs. Wellington would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "perhaps you can explain to the class the circle of fifths and its application in classical composition?" Maya would stumble through an answer using the wrong terms, getting confused, while the other students exchanged knowing looks. Never mind that Maya could sit at a piano and play that circle of fifths, could hear it in her head, could use it in her own playing. that didn't matter here. Here, only the formal knowledge counted. During group discussions, the other students excluded her. When Mrs. Wellington assigned partners for a project analyzing a Beethoven sonata, Maya was left standing alone until the teacher sighed dramatically and assigned her to work by herself. Since no one seems eager to partner with you, Miss Chen, perhaps you can manage on your own. At lunch, Maya would eat quickly in the cafeteria and then escape to an empty practice room. Not to use the beautiful grand pianos, she wouldn't dare, but just to sit in the silence and imagine music in her head. Her fingers would tap against her knees, playing invisible keys, composing melodies that no one else would ever hear. She had been working on a piece for almost 2 years now. It had started as just a simple melody, something she hummed while washing dishes or walking to school. But slowly, carefully, she had built it into something more. She would add a bass line, then a harmony, then a bridge that took the music somewhere unexpected. She played it over and over on her grandmother's piano, refining it, changing it, making it better. The piece told a story. It started quiet and sad, like being alone in a crowd. Then it grew stronger, like finding your voice. There were moments of struggle, where the notes clashed and fought against each other. But then it would resolve into something beautiful, something hopeful, something that said, I'm still here and I matter. Maya had never told anyone about this piece. It felt too personal, too raw. It was like showing someone your diary, your most private thoughts laid bare. Back in the classroom, as the period drew to a close, Mrs. Wellington made an announcement. As you all know, our annual spring recital is in 6 weeks. Each of you will perform a classical piece of your choosing. I expect excellence from all of you. She paused, and that cold smile crossed her face again. Well, almost all of you. Miss Chen, I'm not certain what you might perform given your limited experience. Perhaps we should discuss your options separately. The dismissal bell rang and students gathered their things. Maya packed her notebook slowly, waiting for everyone to leave so she wouldn't have to walk out with them. She could hear them in the hallway, already making plans to practice together, to help each other prepare for the recital. She was alone, as always. But she still had her music, the melodies that played constantly in her head, the piece she'd been perfecting for 2 years. Even if no one else ever heard it, she knew it was good. She knew it meant something. Maya just didn't know yet that everything was about to change. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of anxiety. Every student in Mrs. Wellington's class was buzzing with excitement about the spring recital, discussing their chosen pieces during every break. Maya heard them in the hallways, in the cafeteria, even in the bathroom. I'm doing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one girl announced proudly during lunch. My instructor says it's quite ambitious, but I'm up for the challenge. Well, I'm performing Debussy's Clair de Lune, another chimed in. It's such a beautiful piece. Everyone loves it. Maya listened silently, pushing her cafeteria food around her tray. She still hadn't decided what she would play. More accurately, Mrs. Wellington hadn't told her what she was allowed to play. Every time Maya tried to approach her after class, the teacher would be busy with other students, giving them advice and encouragement that she never offered to Maya. At home, things were getting harder too. Her mother had picked up extra shifts at the diner where she worked, which meant Maya had to watch her 3 younger siblings more often. Her brother Tommy was 8 and full of energy, while the twins, Lisa and Lucy, were only 6 and required constant attention. Maya, I'm hungry, Tommy whined one evening while Maya tried to practice on her grandmother's piano. I just gave you a snack an hour ago, Maya said, her fingers pausing on the keys. But I'm hungry again. Maya sighed and got up from the bench. Her grandmother was resting in her room, not feeling well lately, which meant everything fell on Maya's shoulders. She made peanut butter sandwiches for her siblings, helped the twins with their homework, and by the time she got back to the piano, she was exhausted. Still, she played. She worked on her own composition, the one she'd been perfecting for 2 years. Her fingers knew every note by heart. Sometimes she would close her eyes and just let the music flow, feeling it rather than thinking about it. This piece was part of her soul, and playing it was like breathing. On Monday of the 3rd week, Mrs. Wellington finally made her move. Maya was sitting in her usual spot in the back corner when the teacher walked in with a stack of sheet music. She began distributing pieces to each student, offering words of encouragement and advice. This section here is quite tricky, she told one boy, pointing at his music. but I have complete faith in your abilities. The tempo changes here require careful attention, she advised another girl. Practice it slowly at first, then gradually increase speed. Maya watched as every single student received their sheet music and personal guidance. Her desk remained empty. Finally, when Mrs. Wellington had made her way around the entire classroom, she stopped in front of Maya's desk. "Miss Chen," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've been considering your situation quite carefully. Given your unconventional background and limited access to proper training, I think it would be best if you performed something simple." Very simple. She placed a thin piece of sheet music on Maya's desk. It was a beginner's exercise, something a first-year student might play. Mary Had a Little Lamb arranged for piano. The classroom went completely silent. A few students covered their mouths to hide their smiles. Others simply stared, waiting to see what would happen. Maya felt her face go hot. Her hands trembled as she looked down at the childish piece. This wasn't just an insult. It was a deliberate attempt to humiliate her in front of everyone. "Mrs. Wellington," Maya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can play something more advanced than this." "Can you?" Mrs. Wellington raised one eyebrow. "And where exactly have you been practicing?" "On that broken piano you mentioned? The one in your apartment that's missing keys?" "It's not missing keys," Maya said, her voice stronger now. "Some of them stick, but they all work." Mrs. Wellington laughed, a cold sound that made Maya's stomach turn. "My dear girl, you can't possibly prepare a serious classical piece on such an instrument. It would be embarrassing for you and for this academy. No, I think this simpler piece is much more appropriate for your skill level." Maya wanted to argue. She wanted to tell Mrs. Wellington that she'd been playing piano for 7 years, that she practiced more hours each day than probably anyone else in this classroom. But the words caught in her throat. Around her, students were whispering to each other, and she could feel their judgment like a physical weight. "Unless," Mrs. Wellington said, and her smile turned sharp, "you'd like to demonstrate your skills for us right now? Show the class what you can do?" It was a trap. Maya could see it clearly. Mrs. Wellington wanted her to fail in front of everyone, wanted to prove once and for all that Maya didn't belong here. I need time to prepare," Maya stammered. "Time to prepare?" Mrs. Wellington's voice dripped with false concern. "But surely if you're as capable as you claim, you could play something for us now. Just a simple demonstration?" The other students were fully engaged now, watching the scene unfold like it was a movie. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up in Maya's defense. No one ever did. Maya's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands felt clammy and her vision seemed to narrow until all she could see was Mrs. Wellington's cruel smile. "Well," the teacher pressed, "we have 30 minutes left in class. Surely that's enough time for a quick performance? Unless, of course, you're not actually able to play anything of substance." Maya stood up slowly. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she forced herself to stay upright. She could run out of the classroom, but that would only prove Mrs. Wellington right. She could refuse, but that would be the same as admitting defeat. Or she could walk to that piano and play. "Fine," Maya heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange and distant. "I'll play something." Mrs. Wellington's smile widened. This was exactly what she wanted. Maya up in front of the class, exposed and vulnerable with no preparation and no way to succeed. "Wonderful," Mrs. Wellington said, gesturing toward the grand piano at the front of the room. "Class, let's all give Miss Chen our full attention. She's going to demonstrate her musical abilities for us." Maya walked toward the piano, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. Behind her, she could hear whispers and giggles. Someone muttered something she couldn't quite make out, and others laughed. The grand piano sat there, beautiful and intimidating. Maya had never actually played on this particular instrument. She'd been too afraid to even touch it, worried that somehow she'd damage it, or that someone would yell at her for daring to put her hands on something so expensive. She sat down on the bench, her hands shaking. The keys seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights, perfect and pristine. Nothing like her grandmother's worn, yellowed keys at home. Mrs. Wellington stood off to the side, arms crossed, that satisfied smirk still on her face. She'd won, or so she thought. She'd finally found a way to expose Maya as a fraud, to prove that scholarship students didn't belong in her prestigious music class. Maya looked down at her trembling hands. She had no sheet music, no plan, nothing prepared. She was completely on her own. Behind her, the classroom had gone quiet. Even the whispering had stopped. Everyone was waiting to watch her fail, waiting for the moment when Mrs. Wellington would be proven right. Maya closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Music isn't about the instrument, sweetheart. It's about what's in your heart. She placed her fingers on the keys, and in that moment, everything became perfectly clear. She knew exactly what she was going to play. The piece she'd been working on for 2 years, the one that told her story, the one that came from the deepest part of her soul. Maya opened her eyes, looked straight ahead, and began to play. The first note hung in the air like a question. Soft, gentle, almost apologetic. Maya's right hand played a simple melody, just a few notes that seemed to ask, "Will anyone listen?" For those first few seconds, the whispers continued behind her. Someone giggled. Another student shifted in their chair with a loud scrape. Mrs. Wellington stood with her arms crossed, that smug expression still plastered on her face. But then something began to happen. Maya's left hand joined in, adding a bass line that gave depth to the melody. The notes were careful at first, tentative like footsteps in an unfamiliar place. This was the feeling of being new, of being different, of not belonging. Her fingers found their rhythm on keys that were so much smoother than the sticky ones at home. The melody began to shift. What started as hesitant and questioning grew stronger. Maya's shoulders relaxed and her body began to move naturally with the music. She wasn't thinking anymore about Mrs. Wellington or the students behind her, or the fact that she was supposed to be failing right now. She was simply playing. The piece moved into a section that Maya had written during her hardest days. It was the sound of struggle, of working twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up. The notes came faster now, more urgent. Her right hand danced across the higher keys, while her left hand pounded out a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Not a calm, resting heartbeat, but the kind that comes when you're running, when you're fighting, when you refuse to give up. Behind her, the whispers had stopped completely. Maya didn't notice. She was lost in the music now, in the story she was telling. The piece moved through different emotions like chapters in a book. There was loneliness, long, drawn-out notes that echoed in the silence between them. There was frustration, sharp staccato bursts that crashed against each other. There was sadness, a minor key progression that seemed to weep. Her fingers flew across the keys with a confidence that came from playing this piece hundreds of times. On her grandmother's piano, she had worked through every measure, every transition, every subtle dynamic change. She knew this music like she knew her own name. The grand piano responded to her touch in ways her grandmother's piano never could. When she played softly, the notes were crystal clear, pure as water. When she played with force, the sound filled the entire room, powerful and commanding. It was like the difference between speaking and having someone actually hear you. Maya pressed harder into the keys, building toward something. The music climbed higher and higher, each phrase more intense than the last. This was the part she'd written just last month, the section that represented hope. It wasn't a gentle, easy hope. It was the fierce kind, the stubborn kind, the kind that refuses to die no matter how many times it gets knocked down. The melody soared now, bright and defiant. Her hands crossed over each other, finding notes across the entire range of the piano. High notes sparkled like stars, while deep bass notes thundered like distant storms. The music filled every corner of the classroom, impossible to ignore, demanding to be heard. And then, just when it seemed the music couldn't get any more intense, Maya brought it back down. The volume decreased, the tempo slowed, and the piece moved into its final section. This was the part she'd written late at night, sitting at her grandmother's piano while everyone else slept. It was about finding peace. Not the peace that comes from giving up, but the peace that comes from accepting who you are. The melody was the same one from the beginning, but transformed. Where it had once been questioning and uncertain, it was now confident and sure. The note seemed to say, "This is who I am, and that's enough." Maya's eyes were closed now, tears streaming down her cheeks, though she barely noticed. Every emotion she'd held inside for 3 months, every humiliation, every lonely lunch, every night practicing on a broken piano while her siblings slept, all of it poured out through her fingers. The music built one final time, not loud, but powerful. Every note meant something. Every phrase told part of her story. And then, with a final, gentle chord that seemed to hover in the air like a breath, the piece ended. Maya's hands stayed on the keys for a moment, the last vibrations of sound still humming through the strings. She kept her eyes closed, not ready yet to face whatever was waiting for her. In her mind, she was still in that safe place where only the music existed. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one whispered. No one even seemed to breathe. Maya slowly opened her eyes and looked down at her hands still resting on the piano keys. They weren't shaking anymore. For the first time in 3 months, she felt steady. Then she heard it. A single clap. She turned slightly and saw a girl in the 3rd row, one of the students who had always ignored her, bringing her hands together. Once, twice, 3 times, another student joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire classroom erupted in applause. Not the polite, obligatory clapping that teachers have to remind students to do, but real applause. Enthusiastic, amazed, genuine applause. Some students were standing now. A boy in the front row had his mouth hanging open in shock. The girl who'd been talking about her Rachmaninoff piece was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Even the students who had been cruelest to Maya, who had whispered about her clothes and her scholarship status, were applauding. Maya stood up from the piano bench, completely disoriented. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. She was supposed to fail. She was supposed to be embarrassed. That's what Mrs. Wellington had wanted. She finally looked at her teacher. Mrs. Wellington wasn't clapping. She stood frozen against the wall, her face completely drained of color. Her arms had dropped to her sides and her mouth was slightly open. The smug, satisfied expression was gone, replaced by something Maya had never seen before. Shock. Pure, complete shock. Where? Mrs. Wellington's voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. Where did you learn that piece? The classroom went quiet again, everyone waiting for Maya's answer. Maya wiped her eyes, surprised to find them wet. I didn't learn it, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. I wrote it. A gasp went through the classroom. Several students exchanged looks of amazement. You wrote it? Repeated the girl who'd been talking about Debussy. That entire piece? Maya nodded. I've been working on it for 2 years. That was incredible, said another student, a boy who had never spoken to Maya before. I mean, seriously incredible. I've never heard anything like that. It was so emotional, added another girl. I actually got chills. Mrs. Wellington still hadn't moved. She was staring at Maya like she was seeing her for the first time. Like everything she thought she knew had just been turned upside down. Her carefully constructed world, where expensive lessons and prestigious training were everything, had just been shattered by a girl in worn sneakers playing on heart and raw talent alone. Mrs. Wellington started to say something, then stopped. Her hand went to her throat, touching her pearl necklace like she was checking if it was still there. Class dismissed, she finally said, her voice strange and hollow. Everyone except Miss Chen. The students gathered their things slowly, still buzzing with excitement, still talking about what they'd just witnessed. Several of them looked at Maya with new respect as they filed out. One girl even smiled at her, a genuine smile, not mocking. Then the door closed and Maya was alone with Mrs. Wellington. The teacher walked slowly to her desk and sat down heavily in her chair. She put her head in her hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. When Mrs. Wellington finally looked up, Maya was shocked to see tears in her eyes. Maya stood by the piano, her backpack clutched in her hands, waiting for whatever punishment was coming. She'd been in trouble before for things that weren't her fault, and she knew how this worked. Mrs. Wellington would find some reason to discipline her, maybe even recommend removing her from the advanced music class. But when Mrs. Wellington looked up, Maya saw something she never expected. The teacher's eyes were red and tears were actually rolling down her cheeks. Real tears. Not the angry kind, but something else entirely. Sit down, please, Mrs. Wellington said quietly, gesturing to a chair near her desk. Maya hesitated, then slowly walked over and sat down. She kept her backpack in her lap like a shield. Mrs. Wellington took a deep breath, then another. She pulled a tissue from a box on her desk and dabbed at her eyes, smudging her perfect makeup. For a long moment she just stared at her hands. I owe you an apology, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. A very serious apology. Maya blinked. In 3 months at this school, those were the last words she ever expected to hear from Mrs. Wellington. I have been teaching music for 32 years, Mrs. Wellington continued. She looked up at Maya, and her expression was different now. The coldness was gone, replaced by something raw and honest. I started teaching because I loved music. I loved watching students discover the joy of creating something beautiful. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the school grounds where students were heading to their next classes. I started teaching at schools like this one, expensive private academies, and I began to believe that money and training were what mattered most, that the students with the best instructors and the finest instruments were the only ones who could truly excel. She turned back to face Maya. I was wrong. Terribly, inexcusably wrong. Maya didn't know what to say. She'd imagined this moment 100 times, imagined Mrs. Wellington finally seeing her talent. But in her imagination, it had never felt like this. She'd expected triumph, but instead she just felt tired and confused. What you just played, Mrs. Wellington said, walking back to her desk, was the most genuine, heartfelt music I've heard in years, maybe decades. You didn't just play notes on a piano. You told a story. You made everyone in this room feel something real. She sat down again, looking directly at Maya. And I tried to humiliate you for it. I tried to break you. Why? The word came out before Maya could stop it. Why did you treat me like that? Mrs. Wellington was quiet for a moment. Because you reminded me of someone. You reminded me of who I used to be. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out an old photograph. She held it out to Maya, who took it carefully. The picture showed a young girl, maybe 13 or 14, sitting at an old piano. She wore a simple dress and had a huge smile on her face. It took Maya a moment to realize she was looking at a young Mrs. Wellington. That was me, the teacher said. I grew up in a tiny apartment with my single mother and 2 brothers. We had an old piano that my mother found at a yard sale. Half the keys didn't work properly. But I loved that piano more than anything in the world. Maya looked at the photograph, then at her teacher, seeing her in a completely different light. I got a scholarship to a prestigious music school just like you, Mrs. Wellington continued, and I was treated exactly the way I've been treating you. The other students looked down on me. My teachers doubted me. They made me feel like I didn't belong. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. And instead of remembering how much that hurt, instead of becoming the teacher I needed back then, I became the teacher who hurt me. I became the person I once hated. The classroom felt very small suddenly, just the 2 of them in this moment of painful honesty. When I saw you sitting in the back of my classroom, wearing clothes that were a little worn, carrying that taped-up notebook, I saw myself. And instead of wanting to help you, I wanted to push you down. Because if you succeeded despite everything, it would mean that all my expensive suits and pearl necklaces and years of building this perfect image didn't actually matter. Mrs. Wellington's voice cracked. I was afraid of you, Maya, afraid of what your talent meant. Maya felt tears in her own eyes now. I just wanted to learn, she said quietly. I just wanted to be good enough. You're not good enough, Mrs. Wellington said, and Maya's heart sank, but then her teacher continued. You're extraordinary. What you played today wasn't just good, it was exceptional, and I almost destroyed that. I almost made you believe you weren't worthy. Mrs. Wellington stood up and walked to a filing cabinet. She pulled out a folder and opened it on her desk. I'm going to make this right, she said firmly, and suddenly she sounded like a teacher again, but a different kind. The cold authority was gone, replaced by determination. I'm going to call some people, she said. I know a piano teacher, Professor Chen, who teaches at the conservatory. He's one of the best in the state, and he sometimes takes on exceptional students for free. I'm going to ask him to work with you. Really? Maya whispered. Really? And you're going to have access to the practice rooms here at school, anytime you want. Before school, after school, weekends, I'll make sure you have a key. Mrs. Wellington was writing notes now, her professional efficiency returning, but with a completely different energy behind it. And that composition of yours, she said, looking up at Maya, I want you to perform it at the spring recital. Not some simple piece I assign you. Your piece. The one you played today. Maya felt like she couldn't breathe. But what about the other students? They're all playing famous classical pieces. Let them, Mrs. Wellington said. You're going to show them what real music sounds like. Music that comes from the heart, not just from expensive lessons. She paused, then added more softly. If you want to, that is. I'm done telling you what to do. Maya nodded, unable to speak. Everything was happening so fast. There's something else, Mrs. Wellington said. She pulled out another paper from her folder. There's a competition for young composers. The deadline is in 2 months. I'd like to submit your piece, with your permission. A competition? Maya's voice came out as a squeak. The prize is a full scholarship to a summer music program. It's one of the best in the country. Mrs. Wellington looked at Maya seriously. I think you could win. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next period. Maya jumped, suddenly realizing she was late for her next class. I'll write you a pass, Mrs. Wellington said quickly, pulling out a notepad. As she wrote, she spoke without looking up. Maya, I can't undo the last 3 months. I can't take back the way I treated you. But I can promise you that from now on, things will be different. She handed Maya the hall pass and their eyes met. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wellington said simply. I'm truly, deeply sorry. Maya took the pass, and for the first time since she'd started at Riverside Prep, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Hope. Real, genuine hope. Thank you, she said quietly. As Maya walked to the door, Mrs. Wellington called out, Maya? She turned back. That piece you wrote, what's it called? Maya thought for a moment. She'd never actually named it. It had just been the piece in her mind, something too personal to need a label. I don't know yet, she admitted. Mrs. Wellington smiled, a real smile that made her look years younger. Well, you should think of a name, because I have a feeling a lot of people are going to be asking about it soon. Maya walked out into the hallway in a daze. Students rushed past her, heading to their classes, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was spinning with everything that had just happened. For 3 months she'd felt invisible, worthless, like she didn't belong. And in just 30 minutes, everything had changed. Not because the world around her had changed, but because she'd finally shown the world who she really was. She looked down at her worn sneakers, the ones with the marker covering the tear, and smiled. Maybe being different wasn't something to hide after all. Maybe it was exactly what made her special. The next morning, Maya arrived at school early. Mrs. Wellington had given her a key to the practice rooms, and she wanted to try playing on the grand piano again, to make sure yesterday hadn't been some kind of dream. But as she walked through the hallway, something was different. Students she'd never spoken to before smiled at her. A few even said hello. One girl from her music class actually stopped her. That was amazing yesterday, the girl said, and she seemed genuinely impressed. I've been playing piano for 9 years with a private instructor, and I've never created anything like that. How did you even start writing your own music? Maya wasn't sure how to respond. She'd been invisible for so long that having someone actually want to talk to her felt strange. I just played what I felt, I guess. That's so cool, the girl said. Maybe you could show me sometime? I'd love to learn how to compose. As Maya continued down the hallway, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't the scholarship student anymore, at least not only that. Now she was the girl who'd played that incredible piece. The girl with the gift. Mrs. Wellington kept her promises. That very afternoon, she introduced Maya to Professor Chen, a kind man in his 60s who taught at the State Conservatory. He listened to Maya play her composition, and when she finished, he sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment. How old are you? He finally asked. 12, Maya answered nervously. 12, he repeated, shaking his head in wonder. I've had students twice your age who couldn't compose something with this much emotional depth. You have a rare gift, Maya. He agreed to work with her twice a week, teaching her music theory, composition techniques, and classical training. But he did something that surprised her even more. He listened to what she wanted to learn, asked her about her musical goals, and treated her like a real musician, not just a student. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Maya's life. She practiced every day in the school's music rooms, refining her composition and learning new techniques from Professor Chen. Mrs. Wellington submitted her piece to the Young Composers Competition, giving it the name Maya had finally chosen, Finding My Voice. But the biggest change was in Mrs. Wellington's classroom itself. The teacher seemed like a different person now. She still had high standards and pushed her students to excel, but the cruelty was gone. She started encouraging creativity alongside classical training. She asked students to share what music meant to them personally, not just what they'd learned from textbooks. One day, she brought in her old photograph, the one of her as a young girl with the broken piano, and told the class her story. Some students were shocked, others inspired, but everyone understood her differently after that. Music isn't just about perfect technique, she told the class. It's about expressing something true. Some of you have access to the finest instruments and best teachers in the world, and that's wonderful, but never forget that music comes from here. She placed her hand over her heart. Everything else is just tools. The spring recital approached quickly. Maya practiced her piece until she could play it in her sleep, but this time it was different. She wasn't practicing alone in a back corner, hoping no one would notice her. She was preparing to share something beautiful with people who actually wanted to hear it. 2 days before the recital, Maya got called to the main office. Her heart raced, old fears returning. Had she done something wrong? Was her scholarship in trouble? But when she arrived, she found Mrs. Wellington waiting with a huge smile on her face. The competition results came in, the teacher said, and Maya couldn't read her expression. Then Mrs. Wellington's smile grew even bigger. You won, Maya, first place. Maya felt her knees go weak. I won? You won! Full scholarship to the National Youth Music Program this summer. 4 weeks of intensive composition training with some of the best teachers in the country. Mrs. Wellington handed her an official-looking letter. They said your piece was the most emotionally mature composition they'd received in years. Maya read the letter 3 times, unable to believe the words were real. The local newspaper wanted to interview her. The competition was sending someone to attend the spring recital. Everything was happening so fast. That evening, Maya ran home and burst into the apartment waving the letter. Her mother was making dinner and her siblings were doing homework at the kitchen table. Mom, I won. I won the competition. Her mother read the letter and tears filled her eyes. She pulled Maya into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you, baby. I'm so proud. Her grandmother emerged from her room, moving slowly but smiling. Let me see this letter, she said. And when she finished reading, she cupped Maya's face in her weathered hands. I always knew from the very first time I showed you Middle C that you had something special. But you did this, Maya. You did this all by yourself. Not by myself, Maya said, thinking of her grandmother's old piano, her mother's support, even Mrs. Wellington's change of heart. Never by myself. The night of the spring recital arrived. The school auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and students. Maya waited backstage in her best dress, the only nice one she owned, watching the other students perform their classical pieces. They were all good, technically excellent, exactly what you'd expect from students at an expensive academy. Finally, Mrs. Wellington walked onto the stage to introduce the final performance. Our last performer tonight is someone very special, she said, her voice carrying through the auditorium. Maya Chen is a 7th grade student who reminds us all why we fell in love with music in the first place. She will be performing an original composition titled Finding My Voice. Maya walked onto the stage, her heart pounding. The audience was full of people in expensive clothes, important-looking people who probably had opinions about what real music should sound like. For a moment, the old fear returned. What if they didn't like it? What if they thought she wasn't good enough? Then she saw her family in the 3rd row. Her mother, who'd taken the night off work. Her grandmother, who rarely left the apartment anymore. Her 3 siblings actually sitting still for once. They were all smiling at her, believing in her. She saw Mrs. Wellington in the wings, giving her an encouraging nod. She saw Professor Chen in the audience, his kind face full of confidence. And she remembered what her grandmother had told her years ago, what she'd reminded herself the day she first played this piece in the classroom. Music isn't about the instrument, it's about what's in your heart. Maya sat at the beautiful grand piano and placed her fingers on the keys. The auditorium went silent. She began to play. The music flowed from her fingers like water, like breathing, like the most natural thing in the world. She played the story of a girl who felt invisible, who struggled and fought and refused to give up. She played about loneliness and hope, about broken pianos and broken dreams, about finding beauty in unexpected places. The audience sat completely still, mesmerized. Maya didn't just play notes. She shared her soul. When the final chord faded away, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the auditorium exploded with applause. People stood clapping thunderously. Her mother was crying. Her grandmother was beaming. Students were cheering. But the person Maya looked for was Mrs. Wellington. Her teacher stood in the wings, tears streaming down her face, clapping harder than anyone. When their eyes met, Mrs. Wellington mouthed 2 words. "Thank you," Maya understood. She wasn't just thanking Maya for the performance. She was thanking her for the reminder of what teaching was supposed to be about, for bringing her back to the person she used to be, for showing her that the best music doesn't come from expensive lessons or perfect instruments. It comes from having something real to say and the courage to say it. Later that night, Maya sat at her grandmother's old piano in their tiny apartment. Her siblings were finally asleep and the apartment was quiet. She placed her hands on the familiar worn keys, the ones that stuck sometimes, the ones that weren't perfectly in tune. She smiled and began to play something new, a fresh melody that had been forming in her head all evening. This would be her next piece, she decided, and she already knew what she'd call it. The piano that changed everything. Because that's what her grandmother's old piano had done. It hadn't just taught her how to play. It had taught her that your circumstances don't define your worth, that being different isn't a weakness, and that sometimes the things we're most ashamed of, the worn sneakers, the taped-up notebook, the broken piano, are actually what make us special. Maya played late into the night, composing, creating, losing herself in the music. Tomorrow she'd go back to school, back to Mrs. Wellington's class, back to a life that was still challenging but no longer lonely. She had found her voice, and the whole world was finally ready to listen.